They'd only been married 6 months when she vanished. Her husband told police they were hiking, that she walked ahead, that she simply disappeared. No witnesses, no struggle, no body. But 10 months later, a single letter arrived at the sheriff's office, sent by his mother. No one could have predicted what she wrote, or what it would expose. Because what started as a missing persons case would soon uncover a truth far more twisted than anyone imagined. A marriage built on secrets, a past that was never buried, and a betrayal that came from right inside the home. The kind of case that leaves people wondering, how well do you really know the person sleeping beside you? It was a Sunday evening when the call came in. A man's voice, measured yet shaking, told the 911 dispatcher that his wife was missing. He said they'd gone hiking together. According to him, they had a minor disagreement mid-hike, and she'd walked ahead to cool off. He waited, then walked further down the trail. But she was gone. Just gone. The caller's name was Thomas Aldridge. His wife, Camila Price. Within hours, a search and rescue operation was launched. The hiking area wasn't an especially dangerous area, but the forest stretched wide across hundreds of acres. Drones scanned overhead, while ground teams traced every split trail, ravine, and hidden drop-off. Bloodhounds were brought in by Monday. Helicopters by Tuesday. But as the days passed, one fact became painfully clear. There was no sign of Camila anywhere. Her phone was recovered from the couple's locked car in the gravel parking lot, sitting untouched in the cup holder. Her purse, ID, and water bottle were also left behind. Park surveillance showed the couple entering earlier that afternoon. But curiously, only Thomas was seen returning alone, sometime before dusk. He told investigators he'd assumed she was behind him, and only realized she was missing once he reached the car. Still, there was no evidence of foul play. No blood, no torn clothing, no drag marks, just an open wilderness, and a woman who, by every official account, had vanished without leaving a single clue. Camila's friends flooded social media with pleas for help. Her parents, flying in from Oregon, joined the search by day 3. The missing posters went up. The news coverage grew. Thomas stood in front of cameras more than once, eyes red, voice trembling, asking the public to help bring my wife home. He organized a vigil by the trailhead, lighting candles and speaking softly about her smile, their future, their marriage. And yet, beneath the surface of sympathy, questions began to stir. Not from strangers, but from those who'd seen Thomas up close in the first hours after she disappeared. Volunteers who noted how clean his hiking clothes were. Deputies who thought his description of the argument felt scripted. A missing persons advocate who whispered to a colleague, "He looks like he's trying to cry, not actually crying." Investigators took notice, too, quietly. They re-interviewed Thomas the next week, this time in a more controlled setting. He repeated his timeline, the hike, the disagreement, the moment she walked ahead. But some things shifted. His description of which trail they were on changed slightly. His account of how long he waited at the car became fuzzier. When asked to recount exactly what the argument had been about, he hesitated before saying it wasn't important. By the end of the first week, the official search efforts began to scale down. The park had been combed top to bottom. No scent trails, no clothing, no remains. The trail had gone cold. But not for everyone. Behind the scenes, quiet eyes remained on Thomas. Not because they had proof, but because, sometimes, the absence of evidence is the first sign you're not being told everything. And in this case, everything would depend on who had the strength to speak next. By all outward appearances, Camila and Thomas were a well-matched couple. Their wedding, held at a quiet vineyard in northern Georgia, was understated but tasteful. String lights, neutral florals, a close circle of family and friends. Photos from the day painted a perfect picture. Camila in a lace-back gown, Thomas in a slate suit, their hands clasped under a soft spring sky. Smiles, toasts, laughter. Nothing seemed out of place. But beneath that polished surface, not everyone was convinced. A few of Camila's friends had questions even before the ceremony. The engagement had come quickly. Barely 8 months after she ended a long, emotionally complex relationship with a man she'd dated for nearly 5 years. That breakup had shocked her inner circle. No slow fade, no drawn-out goodbye, just a clean, final split. Then suddenly, there was Thomas. He was polite, well-dressed, articulate. The kind of man who asked questions but never shared much himself. Some described him as respectful, others as distant. When asked about his past, he gave short answers. Never rude, but never warm. Most people chalked it up to personality differences. Camila was expressive and opinionated. Thomas was measured and reserved. In theory, opposites attract. In practice, though, Camila's closest friends noticed a shift. She was no longer as available. Group calls were often missed. Weekend brunches turned into quick texts instead. When she did show up, she seemed distracted, like someone holding something back. Still, she defended the relationship whenever concerns were raised. She told one friend that Thomas made her feel safe and steady, and that after years of emotional highs and lows, that was enough. Maybe she believed it. Maybe she wanted to. But the week before the hiking trip, something cracked. A friend later came forward to say Camila had texted her late one night with a short, unsettling message. "I think something's wrong with him." There was no follow-up. The friend replied, asking what she meant, but Camila never responded. Her cousin also recalled a call that same week. It was brief, almost rushed. Camila mentioned they were going away for the weekend. She didn't sound excited. Instead, she said something strange, something her cousin wouldn't fully understand until months later. "I'm not sure I even know who I married." That line would stick. Camila had always been independent. She managed a client portfolio at a regional marketing firm, had just signed a lease for a home office, and was in talks to launch her own consulting brand. Marriage, for her, had been part of the long game, but never the defining piece. She hadn't been looking to settle down quickly, at least not until Thomas. And that sudden shift? That choice to marry fast, and the even faster retreat from her normal routines? It left people wondering whether the wedding was built more on urgency than understanding. Thomas, for his part, didn't share much about their early life together after she vanished. In interviews, he focused on how kind and sweet she was, but avoided deeper stories. He never spoke about how they met, or what drew them to one another. Just surface details, rehearsed sentiments. The kind of things someone might say when they're performing loss, not living it. What no one knew then, but Camila likely sensed, was that the man she'd promised her life to wasn't just keeping secrets. He was building his entire future on one. And whatever Camila had started to uncover, she never got the chance to say out loud. The house was quiet when Margaret Aldridge pulled into her son's driveway. It was just after noon, a week to the day since Camila had been reported missing. Margaret hadn't announced her visit. She figured showing up with a pot of stew and a mother's presents might bring some comfort. Thomas had always been a private person, even as a child. But grief could be isolating, and she didn't want him to face it alone. She let herself in with the spare key he'd given her months earlier. The air inside was still, a little too still, like nothing had moved in days. The curtains were drawn. A half-drunk glass of wine sat on the side table. But the sound that reached her first wasn't silence. It was laughter. Muffled, low, and coming from the living room. As she stepped further in, Margaret froze. There on the couch sat Thomas, her only child, leaning intimately into another man, as in they were having the kiss of their life. She almost didn't get such from her dead husband throughout their marriage, according to her. They hadn't noticed her. She turned and left, quietly pulling the front door closed behind her. She didn't speak, didn't call out, didn't knock. Just walked briskly back to her car, got in, and drove away. That night, Thomas called. Margaret answered, calm but clipped. She didn't ask questions. She didn't have to. He said he wanted to talk in person. She agreed. The next morning, he showed up at her door, alone. What followed wasn't an argument. It wasn't even emotional. It was confession, measured, burdened, and deliberate. Thomas told her he was gay, that he had been for years, that Eli wasn't just his friend, that their relationship had started long before Camila, that the marriage, while not fake, was never rooted in romantic love. It was a cover, a performance, one he'd hoped would fix everything: the family expectations, the questions, the whispers. He spoke about how tired he'd been of living a double life. Margaret listened, quietly, her face unreadable. When he finished, he looked at her for a long moment and said the only thing he seemed certain of: "I didn't hurt her. I just wanted a normal life." But the words didn't land the way he hoped. Margaret wasn't moved. She wasn't reassured. She was just unsettled. Not because her son was gay, but because of what he hadn't said. Because of the cold precision in his voice. Because something about the whole story, both the truth and the version still withheld, felt rehearsed. She didn't accuse him. She didn't ask where Camila was. She just told him she needed time. And then she watched as her son stood from her kitchen table, thanked her for listening, and left. Margaret didn't tell anyone about what she saw. Not then. Not even when the police came by again for follow-up questions. Not when Camila's family reached out privately asking if she'd noticed anything unusual. She kept it to herself, unsure what was worse: suspecting your child of something unimaginable, or saying it out loud and being right. But from that day forward, something shifted. The proud mother who had defended her son publicly began to drift into silence, into thought, into doubt. And as the weeks passed and no trace of Camila surfaced, Margaret was no longer just grieving a missing daughter-in-law. She was quietly watching her own child, unsure whether she was witnessing pain or performance. In the earliest days of the investigation, Camila Price was treated as a missing person. But quietly, detectives also began building a profile, not just of where she disappeared, but of who she was before it happened. They searched her phone, downloaded her cloud storage, cross-referenced email activity. On the surface, nothing jumped out. No clear signs of an escape plan, no communications suggesting danger. But it wasn't until they began retracing her final weeks that certain patterns started to emerge. Camila had always been digitally present, organized, intentional. She used a shared iPad in the home for casual browsing, social media, Netflix, planning grocery lists, the kind of device both she and Thomas accessed freely. But 2 weeks before she disappeared, her phone history showed repeated Google searches for phrases like "how to check hidden messages" and "deleted iMessage recovery." It was subtle, buried between dinner recipes and client emails. But to the trained eye, it suggested something was off. What investigators didn't know, not yet, was that Camila had already found something. The discovery had come by accident: a forgotten tab on the iPad, a message thread left open, a name she didn't recognize, followed by a string of heart emojis, late-night timestamps, and references to waiting until we can breathe. She read enough to piece it together. Her husband wasn't just distant, he was in love with someone else. And not just someone. Eli. Camila didn't react outwardly. She didn't confide in her closest friends. But she did make a call to her cousin, a woman she trusted but hadn't spoken to in a while. It wasn't a long conversation, and she kept her tone neutral. But one thing stood out. She mentioned they were taking a short trip that weekend, just the two of them, and said almost offhandedly, "There's something I need to deal with." The cousin wouldn't think much of it until later. The night before the trip, Camila opened her email and drafted a message. It was never sent, but it sat in her drafts folder, time-stamped at 11:09 p.m. It read, "If anything happens to me, check Thomas's messages. I know what I saw." That draft would never reach anyone. Neither would the unsent text she typed, and apparently reconsidered before boarding the car. It was short, blunt, a warning dressed as a check-in. "Going to deal with something this weekend. If I don't reply, check in on me." It remained in her phone's outbox. Never sent, never seen. Until much later. For the investigators at the time, none of this was available. They didn't yet know she had started putting things together, that she was building up to a confrontation, that her disappearance wasn't just random. It was a moment she may have anticipated, even if only in the shadows of doubt. Camila had been raised to be diplomatic, careful. She didn't yell when angry. She calculated, and that may have been her undoing, because while she didn't alert Thomas that she knew, she carried the weight of that knowledge silently, quietly preparing for a confrontation that would never happen on her terms. And in those final days, while she continued with work calls and dinner plans and weekend packing, Camila Price wasn't clueless. She was careful, but sometimes being careful isn't enough, especially when the person you're preparing to confront is playing a much more dangerous game than you imagined. 10 months had passed since Camila Price vanished. The vigils had ended. The flyers were gone. The public's attention had moved on. Without a body or any trace of foul play, the case quietly slipped into the ranks of unsolved disappearances. Mysterious, tragic, but stagnant. Search efforts were called off. Weekly updates turned into monthly check-ins, and eventually, silence. Thomas Aldridge had relocated to another city by then, a quieter place. He told those around him he needed space to grieve without the pressure of small-town eyes. Margaret Aldridge had tried to convince herself that her son had told the truth. She'd replayed their conversation over and over, the couch, the confession, the insistence that he hadn't harmed Camila, and for a while she held on to that sliver of belief. But belief has a shelf life when it's constantly eroded by silence, and silence was all she'd gotten from Thomas since. So, one morning in late spring, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, opened a notepad, and began to write. She didn't call the police. She didn't make a scene. She didn't even sign her full name. She folded the paper, slipped it into a plain envelope, and mailed it to the sheriff's department. Attention. Cold cases. It arrived 3 days later. At first, it was treated like any other anonymous tip, until the handwriting was traced back to Margaret. Quiet meetings were held behind closed doors, and just like that, a cold file cracked open again. Detectives began a re-review, this time with fewer distractions and fresh suspicion. They refocused on a name that had slipped by quietly in early interviews: Eli Barrett. They approached Eli Barrett without warning. It wasn't a formal arrest or a confrontational interrogation. Just two plainclothes officers showing up at the apartment complex where Eli had recently moved. They told him they were revisiting missing persons cases, standard procedure, tying up loose ends. They said his name came up because of proximity. That's all. Eli invited them in. He didn't ask many questions, but his hands fidgeted. His eyes darted. He looked thinner than in earlier photos, drawn in the face, like someone holding their breath for too long. He said he didn't know anything new, that he hadn't even been around much when Camila disappeared. His voice, though measured, trembled slightly when he mentioned her name. The officers asked if he'd be willing to speak more formally at the station. He agreed, too quickly. That same afternoon, in a quiet interview room with no cameras and no raised voices, Eli Barrett began to unravel. They didn't press hard. They let the silence do the work. Every now and then, they asked him about that weekend, what he was doing, who he spoke to, whether he had seen Thomas. Eli's answers were clipped and defensive, then contradictory, then slow. At one point, he asked for water. When they brought it, he didn't drink it. He just stared at the table and whispered something. One of the detectives leaned in. "What did you say, Eli?" Eli blinked slowly, then looked up with red eyes. She found out. And just like that, the dam broke. He spoke in fragments, broken pieces of a confession that had lived inside his chest for almost a year. He said Camila had seen the messages, ones Thomas had forgotten to delete. She confronted him days before the trip, furious, disgusted, threatening to tell both families and file for divorce. According to Eli, Thomas begged her not to, said he wasn't ready, that it would ruin him. She refused to stay quiet. And so, they panicked. Eli claimed the plan wasn't murder, at least not at first. Thomas told Camila they needed time alone, away from everyone, to talk and reset. They agreed to take a trip, just the two of them. Camila agreed, possibly to hear him out, possibly to give him one last chance to come clean. Either way, she got in the car that day thinking she had control of the situation. She didn't. Eli followed them in a separate vehicle, under the guise of meeting later at the cabin. But instead of cabins and conversations, they ended up at a dry creek bed, just beyond the line of Eli's grandmother's abandoned property. Eli said it happened fast. A raised voice, an argument. Then, Thomas grabbing her, pushing, his hands around her neck. Camila had no time to scream, no chance to run. Eli said he froze, watched, then helped. Not with the killing, but with everything after. They wrapped her body in a moving blanket Thomas kept in the car. They drove her around the back of the property and buried her just beyond the tree line. It was shallow, rushed, but no one had ever come looking. Until now. Eli agreed to take them there. With quiet footsteps and a trembling finger, he pointed to a patch of earth that still looked out of place. Officers began digging. Camila's remains were found in the same clothes she left the house in that morning. Her body, partially decomposed, told the rest of the story that words couldn't. No more missing posters, no more wondering, no more silence. Camila hadn't vanished. She had been taken, lied to, and buried by the very people who smiled at her wedding 6 months earlier. The arrest came at 6:17 a.m., just as the sun began casting long shadows across the quiet suburban block where Thomas Aldridge had been living under a new lease and a different version of himself. No sirens, no spectacle, just the knock of consequence. He didn't resist. But he asked only one question as they placed him in cuffs. Who talked? By midday, Thomas sat in a holding cage outside the county's courtroom. He looked nothing like the grieving husband from 10 months prior. His suit was sharp, his hair trimmed, his expression unreadable. Inside that courtroom, Thomas did exactly what many expected. He denied everything. He claimed Eli acted alone, that the two of them had been seeing each other, yes, but that he had no idea what Eli was capable of. That Camila had found out about the affair and threatened to expose him. That Eli panicked. That the next time he saw her, she was already dead. He said he was manipulated, used, that he only helped clean up because Eli threatened to drag him down too. But investigators had already peeled back the clean lines of his story, and underneath, they found the truth. During a second forensic sweep of Thomas's electronics, specialists had managed to recover fragments of deleted messages from a cloud backup linked to an old iPad. The texts between Thomas and Eli had been cleared from their phones, but not from the system. The tone wasn't casual. It was coded, layered, and riddled with anxiety. Phrases like, "We need to control this," and "Don't let her flip this on us," appeared more than once. But one message stood out, sent 5 days before the hiking trip. "If she opens her mouth, we lose everything." That single sentence shattered his defense. It revealed planning, premeditation, fear, not of Eli, but of exposure, not of loss, but of being found out. Thomas had always been calculated. That was part of what made the marriage last, as long as it did. He knew how to present sincerity, how to cry without tears, how to say just enough, but never too much. But in court, under fluorescent lights and the weight of a murder charge, the performance cracked. Prosecutors didn't need dramatics. They had Eli's confession, the recovered body, the timeline, the motive, the means. And now, the message. Thomas's defense attorney leaned hard into doubt, suggested that Eli was unstable, that maybe the confession was coerced, that the messages could be interpreted differently. But it didn't matter. The story was too tight, the pieces too snug. Camila's family sat just feet away in the courtroom gallery. They didn't look at Thomas, not once, not during the hearing, not during the presentation of evidence, not even when the judge announced that the case would proceed to trial with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder charges. The man who once begged the public for help finding his wife was now the one everyone had been looking for all along. The courtroom was still when Margaret Aldridge was called to the stand. She moved with the careful steps of someone carrying something too heavy for words. In the months since her son's arrest, she had stayed out of the public eye. No interviews, no statements, no denial. Her silence had become its own story. People wondered what kind of mother she was, what she had known, and how long she'd kept it. Now, she was about to answer. Margaret took her seat. Her hands remained folded in her lap. Her eyes didn't search the room. She didn't look for Thomas. She stared ahead, as if the only way to survive the moment was to ignore who was behind her. When the prosecution asked if she remembered the day she visited her son after Camila's disappearance, Margaret nodded. "Yes," she said. They asked what she saw. There was a pause, brief but charged. "I saw Thomas with Eli Barrett," she said finally. "On the couch. They were close, more than friends." There was no outrage in her tone, no bitterness, just the weight of truth carried too long. She went on to explain how she left the house that day without saying a word, how Thomas came to her the next morning, how he confessed to being gay, how he admitted the marriage had been a front, and how he'd insisted Camila's disappearance had nothing to do with him. "I wanted to believe him," Margaret said, "because I'm his mother. And you want to believe your child, even when something inside you says you shouldn't." The courtroom remained quiet. Even the press gallery seemed frozen. She explained why she stayed silent, how she'd convinced herself there wasn't enough to go on, that maybe Camila really had walked away, that maybe grief just looks different in some people. She told the jury she wrote the letter when she could no longer bear the dissonance between what she knew and what she feared. And then she said the line that would echo far beyond that courtroom. "I thought I was protecting him. I didn't know I was burying her with my silence." A woman seated behind Camila's parents audibly gasped. One of the jurors blinked, rapidly, like someone holding back tears. Thomas sat expressionless, staring at the floor, unmoved, or simply unwilling to react. Margaret ended her testimony with a simple sentence. "The truth doesn't care who you love, but it does care what you do about it." She stepped down without looking at her son. For Camila's parents, the moment wasn't one of triumph. It was just another deep cut in a body already carved up by grief. They didn't nod, didn't cry, didn't move. Their pain didn't need sound. It saturated the space between every word spoken in that courtroom. Margaret's testimony shifted something. Public perception, once split, now tilted. Sympathy turned into scrutiny. People who had once called Thomas a victim began to see him for what he was, an architect of control, deception, and ultimately, violence. But for Margaret, there was no vindication. Only the ache of realizing that love, in its most blinding form, had made her part of the silence that cost a woman her life. And though she had finally spoken, the question lingered like smoke in the air. What would have happened if she had said something sooner? The courthouse was full, but no one spoke. By now, the verdict was a formality. Still, the final day in court carried a weight that couldn't be ignored, not because people didn't know what was coming, but because they did. Eli Barrett had already entered his plea. His cooperation had been detailed, his confession complete. In exchange for testifying and leading detectives to Camila's body, he accepted a sentence of 28 years, with the possibility of parole after 20. Some called it a deal. Others called it mercy. But for Camila's family, it changed nothing. The result was still the same. Their daughter was still gone. He didn't look back as he was led from the courtroom. Just one final glance toward the gallery, where no one waited for him. Then it was Thomas's turn. After weeks of trial, presented evidence, recovered messages, digital footprints, forensic analysis, and Margaret's own testimony, the jury took less than 4 hours to return a verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. It was final, absolute, the kind of sentence that left no door open. The court was given an opportunity to hear any final words. The judge turned to Thomas, asked if he wanted to speak. He stood, slowly, adjusted his shirt cuffs, and shook his head. No. No apology, no acknowledgement, no remorse. Just silence. And just as the judge thanked the jury and moved to adjourn, one figure quietly stood and walked out of the courtroom. Margaret Aldridge. She didn't stay to hear the final gavel. She didn't wait for the bailiffs to move. She rose, walked down the center aisle, and exited through the heavy courtroom doors with slow, deliberate steps. Some assumed she was ashamed. Others believed she was grieving the child she no longer recognized. But those who had followed the case closely knew better. Margaret's silence had once protected a lie. Her voice, too late, had helped dismantle it. But there was no satisfaction in either. Camila's family declined to speak. There was nothing left to say. And Thomas Aldridge, the man who built a life out of half-truths, who played both husband and victim, was finally silent in a place that would not forget. In the end, it wasn't a moment of justice that made people pause. It was the emptiness in the room after. A man with no remorse, a mother who walked away, and a woman buried not just in earth, but in betrayal.